Editor-in-Chief of Facility Executive Magazine, and this webinar is presented by Siemens Building Technologies. Before we get started, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping items. Please note the control panel that's on your screen. This is where you can submit questions via that question box in the panel. You can send these questions in at any time, and our speaker will be addressing them throughout the presentation, or I'm sorry, at the end of the presentation. Also, please note the orange arrow on the left side of this panel. Clicking on that arrow will either expand or collapse the control panel. So please be sure it's open so you can access the question box. And if at any time you experience a technical difficulty, please send a message to us in that question section also. As part of this webinar presentation, Siemens recently conducted a survey of facility executive readers, and each respondent had a chance to win a $100 gift card. We'll announce that winner toward the end of the presentation today. So let's get started and meet today's speaker, Dan Finnegan, Manager of Industry Affairs for Siemens Building Technologies. Dan has 40 years of experience serving in all aspects of the fire protection and life safety profession. He spent 10 years in fire service as a paramedic and Director of Fire Prevention Bureau in the Chicago suburbs, and 30 years with Siemens Fire. Dan is active in code development within the NFPA and ICC for fire and life safety, and he holds leadership positions on key fire and life safety organizations. Dan holds a degree in fire protection technologies, and he is a certified fire protection specialist by NFPA. So without further ado, let's welcome Dan.
Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen and collaborators in the fire life safety industry. I'm excited here today to be able to talk with you about this topic. And, you know, the objective of our discussion today is to gain a better understanding of NFPA inspections, testing, and maintenance requirements. We will look at the why, the what, the who, the when, and the how to maintain your fire life safety systems. NFPA standards, of course, are very extensive, and it would take several days to cover all of the requirements. The goal of today's presentation is to give you a better understanding of some of the key elements that will help ensure your fire life safety systems operate properly in the event of a fire and that your systems meet compliance standards. You can see here that we're going to touch on, you know, why is the inspection, test, and maintenance needed. We're going to talk about what standards should be used. We'll touch on this concept of when services need to be performed. There is lots of charts and graphs that are at your disposal for that. We're going to touch on the very important topic of who can perform services. As I sit here speaking to many of you, our facility executives, facility managers, you know, we're going to be able to touch on the fact that folks within your organization do have the power within meeting certain requirements to be able to be involved in the services process. Very important area we'll touch on is the documentation that is required during, just after the inspection, and more importantly for retention. We'll give some ideas about the development of a service plan to help ensure compliance. Then we're going to take a little pause, and then we're going to switch gears, and I'm going to share with you a brand new NFPA standard that has just been published here within, let's say, the last 6 months. It's titled NFPA 4, which is the standard for integrated fire protection and life safety system testing. So without further ado, let's march forward here, and we'll go on to the next slide where we're going to talk about the kind of at a high-level view of where we're headed. As long as I get my slide to move forward, we're going to be in great shape here. Okay, well, I'm sure the slide will catch up with us, but we're going to touch on NFPA 25 and NFPA 72. And we're going to see that they are, NFPA 25 is for your fire sprinkler systems, NFPA 72 is for your fire alarm system. And they both work together, and of course they both save lives and property. And you know what's really important about what we're doing here in our conversation today, combining both that fire sprinkler system and the fire alarm, the detection, the notification form of the system, is they both need to work right the first time. You know, and that's different than many other systems that we have in our buildings. These things must work right the first time. We don't really have a second chance in fire life safety. You know, we can probably do without an elevator in a building. We could maybe do without air conditioning for a little while. And sometimes we can do without escalators and other important building systems. But the fire sprinklers and the fire alarm systems need to rise to the top of the list as far as importance goes as we march forward. And the fact of the matter is, as many of you are aware, these things are interconnected. The fire sprinkler system, piping throughout the building, has many electronic connections that tie back into the fire alarm system so that they are connected physically. And they have similar testing frequencies. You know, if you do these things in parallel, you'll find that, you know, many of these things have to be done in similar frequencies. And then when you are testing with one of the systems, for example, when you're testing the fire sprinkler system, you are going to be activating and interacting with the fire alarm system. So we need to have knowledge on both of those aspects of things. And that survey that Ann had mentioned, you know, we got some interesting data back from time to time. And one of the notes that I picked up on was that 67% of the surveyors mentioned that they do have the same service provider doing both their fire alarm and their fire sprinkler service work. Thought that was interesting. And also 75% of those surveyed felt that they were meeting the requirements of the codes and standards that were applicable for their areas. Therefore, that tells us 25% of them were not. So I'm hoping they're here today so we can help bring everyone along and bring everyone up to speed as we march forward here. So as I mentioned before, the two codes on your screen, NFPA 25 and NFPA 72, are the key documents. 25, water-based fire protection systems, is the fire sprinkler system standard. And then next to it is NFPA 72, which is, of course, the document on the National Fire Alarm and Signaling Code. It's interesting to note, too, on NFPA 72, years ago that used to be just known as the National Fire Alarm Code, but just recently they've changed that to include signaling, because in today's world, you know, signaling is just as important as detection. By signaling, of course, we mean the notification and the communication that takes place. Now, I will share with you something that we are not going to have to worry about providing inspection and testing for, and that, of course, is the never-ending Jiffy Pop popcorn heat detector that hopefully is not inside of any of your buildings or any of your residences. You know, I put this with a little bit of humor up there. You know, those of us who grew up with the Jiffy popcorn knows that it makes a lot of noise when it warms up, and some people were thinking that maybe that could become a heat detector, but let's stand on record here and confirm the fact that that is not a heat detector as we go forward. So now let's get back to the important stuff, and that is, why is it important to maintain fire life safety systems and equipment? You know, and this is kind of blocking and tackling, but it's kind of good to kind of get a feel for this. You know, it certainly maximizes system performance and reliability. You may ask, well, gee, Dan, why is that? Well, the fact of the matter is that things change in our buildings. You know, you may be the building manager, the building executive, maybe the chief engineer of the building. Your building may have been there for 10 years. It's when the systems were initially installed. And you know what? Those buildings are going through changes. You know, we're going to talk about floor plan changes, changes in walls, changes in rooms. What this dedicated inspection frequency does is it provides a dedicated focus to make sure that we're going to carve out some time and make sure that our fire life safety systems are doing the things that they need to do. You know, it certainly goes without saying that it helps protect our occupants, our property, and our business continuity, reduces emergency repairs, and that's an established fact. Preventive maintenance, doing the work up front, will definitely reduce your overall life cycle cost that could occur on the maintaining of critical systems. You know, it's always important to meet your insurance requirements. But, you know, there's another really important piece here, and that is to support the positive relationships with your fire department, your fire prevention bureaus, your fire service that supports your building. You know, by involving them in this process, letting them know what you're doing, and copying them with the reports that are published from the inspections, you're showing them that you're being proactive, doing due diligence, and getting things taken care of in a very positive and professional way. This is important to keep them involved. After all, it's their lives are on the line when they respond to a fire situation in your building. And of course, in concert with that, these proper applications of these systems will decrease citations and noncompliance fees. It minimizes risks and liabilities that may occur. On the next slide here, we are jumping into a little bit more on the why. And there's some interesting facts that'll be popping up here in regards to fire sprinkler systems. And the data on the slides that you're going to be looking at is from NFPA report titled U.S. Experience with Fire Sprinklers. And this is from Dr. John Hall, the recently retired research scientist with NFPA. And as you can see on the slide here, it shows that when sprinklers failed to operate, the reason most often was the fact that the system had been shut off, the water shut off in essence, 64% of the failures. Other leading causes include manual intervention that defeated the system. That's when somebody went in and shut the system off too soon. Or it could be damaged components, lack of maintenance, and inappropriate system for the type of fire that was there. And when sprinklers operated on the chart on the right, but were ineffective, the reason usually had to do with insufficient water supply being applied to the fire. So the key point here is that when the system fails, when a fire sprinkler system should fail, 2/3 of the time it's because the valve that controls the water was closed instead of being open. And when the systems operate but were not effective, about 1/2 of the cases, it is because the water did not reach the fire. This could be due to such things as partially closed valves as we talk. So it's not completely closed, it's just partially closed. Obstructions, changes in storage, and some of the things we talked about, the fact that, if you change the floor plan, you change the layout. In the case of a sprinkler system, if you change the commodity type, all these things can have an impact. All of these are the things that are looked at when your preventive maintenance, when your inspection and testing activities are done and move forward with. So now on the fire alarm side, you don't get the same type of statistics that we have on the fire sprinklers. But, as I mentioned before, that fire alarm system must work right the first time. You don't get a second chance with these systems. The fire alarm system is electronic. It's monitoring the atmosphere in the case of smoke detectors 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And you need to make sure that those things are addressed and tested to make sure they're performing well. We talked about the occupancy changes that may be occurring. And, by doing the preventive maintenance inspection work, you'll find that the system, whether or not it's still complying with the codes. The picture that we show here, is showing a bad case scenario. It's showing a picture of when somebody did not install things correctly and there was a poor workmanship issue. Some of your management responsibilities, you may be taking over a building that was being managed or handled by somebody else. And you may be walking in and finding these things because somebody in the past wasn't doing the right due diligence and the right level of focus on inspection and testing to make sure things are done. Things like this would obviously be found during an inspection, both visual and through the testing aspect of things, and would need to be corrected. As we march forward onto the next slide, let's touch base on, okay, how does the NFPA determine the inspection and testing requirements? And this is kind of good background information to have. We know that the NFPA's mission is to reduce the worldwide burden of fire and other hazards by providing and advocating consensus codes and standards, research, training, and education. The different committees, 25 and 72, really strive to balance the required inspection, testing, and maintenance tasks in relationship with the probability that performing these tasks will help ensure the system's functions. So in other words, there's a lot of data that's done. When we get to taking a look at the charts and you see that they say you need to test a water flow switch, quarterly or semi-annually, and you need to test a control valve on a sprinkler system at a certain frequency. That stuff isn't just made up. It's done based on studies, by research, and is being looked at and reviewed every 3 years for possible change. The purpose is to provide an overall reasonable degree of protection through the minimum amount of inspection, testing, and maintenance. It's worth restating the fact that all of these standards are minimum. NFPA and most codes in general give you what the minimum requirement is. And we're going to talk about how sometimes those are adjusted. Now let's take another look at another different phase of this, and let's say, well, who are the stakeholders? Who's in charge of this? It's sometimes eye-opening to the ownership, and you representing the owners in the world of being the facility executive, the facility manager, that per the code, it is the owner's responsibility to make sure that the testing and maintenance is performed. In the case of sprinkler systems, that we're maintaining temperature in the building so things don't freeze, that we're providing access to the important features. We're notifying tenants and others that there will be a system shutdown during testing. And as you can see the list, I'm not going to read through it all. Maintaining of records, we're going to get back to that in a little more detail. So the owner has a fair amount of responsibilities here. The authority having jurisdiction, of course, is responsible for the enforcement. That's why, as I pointed out earlier, your relationship with your local fire service is important. The authority having jurisdiction could also be, in the case of the GSA, it's themselves, the federal government. In the case of others, it could be other agencies and other authorities, but you will know who those folks are. And of course, last but not least is the service contractor. They're responsible for providing the owner with all the information and the facts about the conditions of the systems, reports, and completing the scope of work per their contract. It really sums up and highlights the importance of finding a real trusted partner in the fire life safety industry, because everything we've talked about here today so far is rather fluid. These codes and standards continue to change. It's not a simple black and white type of approach, even though we try to write codes that way. This stuff is getting more and more complex today as our buildings are advancing into more complexity, which we will certainly touch on here as we continue to march forward. Next slide is going to kind of share with you a myriad, not intended to overwhelm anybody, but it's important that we touch on the fact that there are various fire codes and standards that need to be used and recognized when putting together your overall, fire safety plan. The easy ones, of course, come from the NFPA, which are the ones we just talked about, NFPA 25 for fire sprinklers and NFPA 72 for the fire alarm aspect. But it's important to realize that the federal government also has regulations. Our friends at OSHA, have regulations for safety within all of our buildings. Now, OSHA, as you're aware, doesn't normally come in and do inspections from a prevention standpoint, but unfortunately, when somebody is injured or somebody dies in a fire situation, OSHA has the power to come in and assess fines when things aren't being done right. For OSHA to be done right is generally complying with the national fire codes and the national fire standards of NFPA. There's also the CMS, which stands for the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. Those are the folks that fund our healthcare industry, and therefore they have their own set of standards that complement and sometimes modify the NFPA requirements for fire protection and life safety. So there are regulations there that need to be dealt with, and those are oftentimes different editions of what your local agency may be following. As we talk about, we get to the next item here, which is the state level administrative codes. Your state, I know that, so for example, the state of Louisiana has their own state codes that the state fire marshal adopts and moves forward. Same with the folks, if we have some folks there from California, our friend Tanya Hoover, the state fire marshal in California, California produces their own state level fire codes and requirements that need to move forward that control things within that state. Sometimes those can be a little different than the national codes that we reference above. They have the ability to do that. Same with the Department of State Health Services. They're going to work in conjunction with that CMS, but they can do things a little bit differently because at a state level they have their own power. And then don't wait, because things can get a little bit more complicated. The local city administrative codes may enter in. The city of Dallas will have its own fire code that may have few different requirements than what the state of Texas requires. And if you were lucky enough to be sitting in the city of Chicago in this audience, you know what I'm talking about when the city of Chicago writes their own code that really doesn't reflect anything else that's going on in international codes. But the good news is under building codes here, we know that about 90 to 92% of the United States does follow the International Building Code and the International Fire Code for their enforcement and guidelines when building. So that's the good news, that there is a fairly standardized building code and fire code that directs what NFPA standards to utilize. What gets to be your challenge, though, is they adopt different editions. Right now, today, the current edition for the International Building Code is the 2015 edition, but I would suspect most of your cities, towns, communities are probably following the 2009, the 2012 edition, something of that nature. So here's where your trusted service provider needs to be able to provide for you the knowledge that says, okay, we're sitting here in Dallas, we're sitting here in New Orleans, Louisiana, and here's what codes are actually being enforced and guided for you in your specific area. There are a couple of other areas here. The ISO folks, that's a quality management system that companies and organizations get rated by. They have their set of standards. We mentioned the Joint Commission. They're connected with the CMS. That's all part of the healthcare world. And then, of course, your insurance underwriter. Most insurance companies rely on NFPA, but once again, not all. The folks within Factory Mutual, FM, they write their own standards. Once again, are very similar to NFPA, but sometimes they take, based on their own risk analysis, they'll make changes and say, we've got to follow this specific requirements in the FM approval guide. So it's a matter of just knowing where we need to go, because things can be different and fluctuating. So now we're going to touch base on when does that equipment in your building need to be inspected, tested, and maintained. And as I mentioned earlier, NFPA defines the things that they put in their code books as minimum requirements. But those authorities having jurisdiction, which could be your fire department, could be a governmental agency ownership type of thing, the authority certainly can adjust that frequency. Once again, another part of what your trusted service advisor needs to be aware of and should be of a consultant nature to you. And there will be times where you may have a product in your building that does not show up in the code book. In that case, you always are pointed to follow the manufacturer's recommendations. This is very true if you have some specialized gas detection sometimes and specialized cutting-edge fire suppression systems. You may not find those listed in the NFPA code today, and you will be guided to follow the manufacturer's recommendations. But in any case, you always want to make sure that you use the most stringent of frequencies as you take a look at these different charts and graphs that are made forward here that we'll be looking at in a second. And this stuff all revolves around a plan. Every good process, because this mission of providing good fire life safety in your building is a process, and every good process needs a plan. The words that we have here on the screen are actually based on NFPA 72, but they're very similar in 25, and that is that there is a requirement that a test plan be written, a plan that clearly establishes the scope of the testing for the fire alarm and signaling system. A test plan and the results shall be documented, and it needs to have the who, what, when, and how. And what does that really mean? That really means the fact that in today's systems, if you're sitting there in a high-rise building, You may have smoke detection that's required to be, tested once a year. But for economics and logic, you may say, you know what, we're going to do 25% every quarter, so that at the end of the year, we've tested the entire system per the code. Therefore, you need to really document what floors, what zones, what number of detectors are we testing in the first test sequence, the second test sequence, the third test sequence, and what audible devices were tested accordingly. So, by putting this plan together, you're also going to know that these systems interface, as we've mentioned, with other building systems. So you're going to have that accessibility to have it. So a test plan is well worth the time and investment. And once again, this is something that your trusted service advisor should be able to help guide you with and provide for you. Now, the next slide that will pop up is a snapshot of what the code documents will actually show inside. And that is, it'll give you information for those that haven't seen it. This is a picture out of NFPA 25, what the actual testing frequencies are. You'll see that for each component, you get a slide there that'll show you exactly what frequency for each device needs to be inspected, tested, and maintained. And let's talk about that differentiation. The concept of inspection really means visual. That means you can walk around the building, look at that sprinkler valve, and make sure that that valve is open. That would qualify for an inspection. You can inspect the gauge on a sprinkler system. You can inspect the smoke detector in a building to make sure that there are no obstructions, that it's there, and that it looks like it's operating correctly. As you go forward, you'll see that the testing frequency is the same way. That is the actual frequency for testing. And it'll tell you how often you need to physically activate that device, move that device, and make it function and operate accordingly. So that's good guidelines there. The next slide that's popping up, of course, is the inspection forms. Every good contractor will have their own set of forms put together for you. NFPA produces, we'll call it, standard templates of what these forms should contain, or the code will tell you what the form needs to have in it. But you'll find that many of the good providers will have their own set of forms made up, and that they will become your record documents. And in today's arena, things are becoming more and more electronic, and you're seeing these things being performed and executed in many forms of technology, from laptops to iPads to smartphones, and everything are being used to be able to pull this information together as we go forward. So let's touch on the important statement about who can perform the services. The codes themselves, 25 and 72, state that the service personnel shall be qualified and experienced in the area that they're inspecting, testing, and maintaining. Therefore, a person who is experienced in fire sprinklers can do fire sprinklers, but maybe not necessarily fire alarms unless he's also been cross-trained. And you can see here in 25, they're giving you a definition of qualified, competent, and capable person. What generally it boils down to is the examples of the qualified personnel. The fact that the AHJ and yourself should be looking at the fact that, are these folks factory trained and certified on the fire alarm product and up to including the fire sprinkler control valve, if it's a dry pipe system or a suppression system of clean agent nature. They will get certified in factory training for that. NICET certification, the National Institute for Certification of Engineering Technologies, is an excellent resource. This is a third-party testing agency that creates criteria in order to certify individuals based on the successful passing of a test on the given competencies for a level that they will be given in order to provide execution on the inspection and testing world. So there are NICET certifications for fire sprinklers. There's NICET certifications for fire alarms, as there are for other building components. but those are the two we're focused on here. And that's probably the most popular one today. Many of the state laws that I mentioned the state fire marshal may conduct, many of your states are saying that, you know, in my state, in order for you to work on a fire alarm system, you have to at least be NICET level 2. Or to do a sprinkler job, sprinkler work, you need to be NICET level 2. I know for the state of Illinois, they have the ruling for fire sprinklers that you need to be NICET level 2 and you need to be licensed. So that's just a solid certification. That gives you, the building owner, the building manager, that facility executive, the comfort to know that this person has knowledge of the codes, working knowledge of the functionality of the systems, and has had X number of years of experience in the field before he can achieve that certification. So that's an important piece to realize. There also may be some certifications issued by state and local authorities. They may be giving their own tests. Once again, your local service trusted advisor would be able to help you there. And also sometimes union fitters are required. Union fire sprinkler fitters are very well trained and often have these exact same certifications we mentioned above already built in to their training platforms. So now it's time for the documentation. So we've thought about it, we understand the value, the need, we've kind of got an idea of, you know, how these things come together in the code, and now we're getting the right people to do the work, and now we need to get back to now we're going to get documentation to show that the work has been done. And there's a couple of important critical statements that need to be made here. First of all, that second bullet on the left-hand side, that all as-built drawings, hydraulic calculations in the area of fire sprinklers, the original testing records, cut sheets shall be retained for the life of the system. It's important, very important to realize that. Subsequent records, these would be the annual, semi-annual testing and maintenance of the system, can be retained for a period of 1 year after the next inspection. NFPA 72 actually goes one step further for a fire alarm system and requires that a documentation cabinet be installed near the system control panel or at another approved location in the protected premises. So it's an actual red box that's labeled fire alarm documentation, and in there resides the as-built drawings, the software program, and you know what's happening today? Many times it's a flash drive that contains all this information electronically. And on the right-hand side, you can see what the report must contain, and that's all pretty basic information from out of the code. But if I were to make a recommendation that maybe may consider to be above and beyond the code, is do the best you can to keep this data electronically, and I would keep it for as long as you possibly can, because if an event, a fire, anything serious should ever occur in your building, the more positive documentation that you have that shows that you did your due diligence, that you were proactive in your fire safety management, that you have 10 years worth of records here that show your system's performance and maybe a few deviations and a few repairs and a few things have taken place, that will be of great value to you overall in the big picture of things. It was also interesting to note that our survey that we took showed that 65% of the respondees thought that they should keep their records for 5 years. So, you know, that's kind of in between this, but you definitely need to make sure you keep those original records for a longer period of time. So how should a service agreement be developed? And this slide is, you know, you're all going to get a copy or you'll have access to this presentation. And this is really in here to help guide you when you're taking these steps on your own. As you're reading through this, one of the things I'd like to point out that is something that is not suggested always, and that is the statement of, well, we want to make this thing meet the code. And meet the code, as we have learned, means an awful lot today because there's an awful lot of codes. You know, I always like to try to structure this thing to really meet the needs of you, the building operator, the building owner. You know, that's what's really going to be important on this thing. You, your service provider, really should meet your own personal objectives also. I can just make an assumption that many of the facility executives, the facility managers here in the audience all have objectives to have certain performance levels, certain KPIs, key performance indicators on the maintenance and the performance of the various systems in your building. You should make sure that your service provider is tied into the same level of requirements that you are being judged and reviewed on an annual basis. But as a minimum, you want to make sure that you go through the chart that we have here. That identifying of the frequency of requirements, the accessing of the business needs, when the service needs to be performed. Is it during, before, or after business hours? When we're doing voice communication systems, voice evacuation systems in buildings, sometimes those can be arranged so that it actually coincides with a fire drill that the building safety or building risk management will say, when I want to run a fire drill in my building, so sometimes it's coincided with the fire alarm testing so that both happen at the same time. Other times, we don't want people to be bothered. You got to come in between 12 midnight and 6 o'clock in the morning to test the voice evacuation system. So all of this should be spelled out as part of that plan we talked about and part of the checklist that we need to follow as we go through these things. So that's just a checklist for yourself there. And this next slide is very similar to that, and this would be questions that you could ask, your service provider, review as your checklist of putting together your good service overall plan. Who's my account team? What are their skills? These are the things we just talked about. So it's somewhat of a summary of those items as we go forward here. So I'm going to move to the next slide now, which is going to take us to our question and answer period. And Ann, do we have any questions so far?
Yes, Dan, we have received a few questions, and thank you for that insight so far on NFPA 25 and 72 and as it relates to inspection, testing, and maintenance of sprinkler and fire alarm systems. We do have a few questions that will take a few minutes to answer. Let's see. Question we have here is, what year or edition is Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services following for fire alarm inspections as it relates to NFPA standards?
Sure, yeah, the CMS right now is still following the 2000 edition of NFPA 101. So that means for the fire alarm system, they're actually following back to the 1999 edition of 72 and the 1998 edition of 25. This is that exception, like I mentioned, where you got to watch out, specifically what agency is involved in, because our federal government is far behind in adopting the new standard. There is significant reason to believe that sometime within the next year, they're going to adopt the 2012 edition of 101, which will bring 72 and 25 up to probably the 2010, the 2009 editions. But we can't say that for sure until it happens.
Thank you. And also, here's another question for you. As a priority, how important is it to tie into fire alarm control panels into a building's HVAC controls for monitoring smoke detectors, flow switches, and other devices in existing buildings where they're currently independent? So.
Could you repeat that? Under what type of system? What type of system do they refer to?
Yes. It says, how important is it to tie in fire alarm control panel into HVAC controls for monitoring smoke detectors, flow switches, and other devices where they are currently independent? So it's a question about tying in those fire alarm control panels.
There you go. Certainly, sure.
Yeah.
That is a good practice. In today's world, being able to have a single workstation, a single way for a building engineer, a building manager to be able to see everything that's happening in their building, there's a lot of logic and there's a lot of value to doing that. The systems are going to be parallel. They're going to be installed separately still. Your HVAC, your fire alarm, your fire sprinkler, and maybe even throw the word security in there also. But to be able to bring all of these together into an integrated visualization and a visual integrated control approach is important, as long as it's important to the mission of your building and of your operation. It's not needed in every building, but the more complex the building, the more logical it is to have that integrated approach today to being able to manage things and view things and share that information back and forth.
Thank you, Dan. And just one quick question before we move on. In terms of when it comes to documentation, can the documentation cabinet be soft-sided, or does it require an enclosure? And where is it to be located, and how long has that been a requirement?
Yeah, the document cabinet came about in the 2013 edition of 72. Yeah, there was also some discussion on it in the 2010 edition of 72. It is designed to be a hard cabinet. Its location is specified to be at the location of the fire alarm panel, but when that's not logical, such as the fire alarm panel is in the lobby of the building, then you can get approval to locate it where the authority having jurisdiction and the building management agreed to. Oftentimes a building engineer's office has been acceptable and things of that nature.
Thanks, Dan, and we can move on now. Thank you.
All right, thank you, and thank you for those who had asked those questions, and you're going to have a chance to be able to ask some more as we go through. Now, we're getting ready to enter into the next exciting evolution here. We've kind of wrapped up the blocking and tackling of the inspection, testing, and maintenance pieces, and now we're going to touch base on the brand new standard that has been released by NFPA, the 2015 edition of the Integrated System Testing Standard. And what's going to be important here is that I give you a couple minutes of history and a few of the whys before I start telling you what this is. And for those of us that have been in the construction side of the business, for those of you who have been involved in your buildings when they were under construction, we know that buildings are built based on specifications in the construction process. You know, the electrical contractor has a contract. In his contract is to do the fire alarm system. There's a mechanical contractor. Chances are he's responsible for the sprinkler contractor work because it's mechanical, it's pipe and water. And these things go up the building in a very vertical format. And as someone who had the opportunity to manage a fire alarm office in the Chicagoland area for about 25 years, of all the high-rise buildings we did in the city of Chicago, they all went this way. The fire alarm system was installed. We would have interfaces to fan controls, interfaces to door releases, interfaces to elevator shutdown. But what our job was to pipe wire and to test everything up to a relay. Everything we did ended at a relay contact somewhere. And then maybe in this technology's advanced, sometimes maybe it was a data port that would go out. But we would test to a certain point. We would not take the testing all the way and actually watch the elevators get recalled to the alternate floor, because that was the elevator contractor's job. You know, our job was to give him 4 relays, and these 4 relays were programmed to do certain things based on the inputs that came through. And that not only has been the industry accepted way of doing things, but recently being within the last 3 years, NFPA has come out with a directive that says those of you doing design and installation and service work within fire alarms or sprinklers, your job is to only stay within your scope of work area. Matter of fact, NFPA is now saying we can't go out and touch the fire sprinkler system or the building control system or the security system within the scope of 72. So they have also drawn this line of demarcation, we'll say, at that relay type of situation. So what that has led us to, has led the industry to, is the creation of NFPA 4, which is the standard for testing of integrated systems. It's the testing from end to end. It's the testing of when that smoke detector goes off, how it activates the fire alarm panel, how that fire alarm panel sends a signal to the HVAC controller to close a damper, to the elevator controller to recall elevators, to maybe unlock some stairwell doors, and those types of things. Those kind of functions are now in what they call integrated testing. And we have a visualization here to kind of show you why the fire alarm system is oftentimes looked at the center of this. When you see the description above, or the visualization here at the on the slide, you'll see that the fire alarm system in the center, but it connects, talks to, communicates, and interacts with all those things around the circle. Certainly the fire sprinkler system. We're looking at tamper switches, water flow switches. We may be activating solenoid switches on dry pipe systems. We have got smoke control, elevators, door locks, all these other functionalities that you can see connected into it here. So that's why the fire alarm system is oftentimes in the center. You'll see that the scope of the document is pointed out here. The fact of the matter that the standard shall provide the minimum requirements for testing of integrated fire protection. What's important to understand here, and this can get confusing. I do sit on this technical committee, but I do not speak for NFPA. It was confusing as this thing was being identified, is that this is not affecting the testing of the individual system. For that fire sprinkler system, you still test per NFPA 25. For the fire alarm system, you still test per NFPA 72. But when it comes to making sure that these systems all work well together and do what they're supposed to through an integrated or across all lines, that's when NFPA 4 is followed and applied. You'll see that there's key definitions in there for the integrated systems test, the end-to-end integrated test. Once again, it's just helping to kind of define what does this mean. You know, I always like to use that end-to-end concept because that's letting us know that, once again, I'm testing that smoke detector in the elevator lobby, watching it go through the control panel, watching it actually recall the elevators to make sure that these things are actually happening. There is in the requirements in the code this concept of an integrated testing agent. Now this should not be there to scare anybody. This is not for every building, but when the building or the campus, in the case of a university or maybe even a hospital campus, is complex, the code does allow for an individual to be identified by the owner who actually plans, schedules, and manages this. You know what? This is being done already by somebody. We've just put a name on it, calling him the integrated testing agent. And we're going to get back to a little bit more detail about when these things kick in, because I'm sure that's coming up in your mind. You'll also see some additional definitions for your reference on what that individual system is. You know, that's what we traditionally had, the fire alarm panel that just sat there, didn't interconnect with anything else. That's your individual system. The minute you have the fire alarm system, sprinkler system, the HVAC system for smoke control, and maybe security for door locking and unlocking, you now have an integrated system that needs testing in accordance in a proper way. So here comes the cool stuff. When do we need to do this? And it starts out with, in the most basic element, is when the building is actually being installed. When the building is being built, on the initial aspect of it is when you need to do an integrated test per NFPA 4. And the next slide will show that in a little bit more detail here. But that's to be required by and during the commissioning process. So when you commission your building, you've got these things going forward. Traditionally, every contractor is going to pre-test and certify their own system. The fire alarm system is going to get certified and pre-tested. Same with the sprinkler system, same with the HVAC control. What this requirement now in NFPA 4 is going to require is the formal end-to-end acceptance testing. And you know what? That can often be done at the same time you're doing the fire department walkthrough, or maybe an owner's or consulting engineer's walkthrough. It doesn't have to mean we have to do a whole nother series of tests. These things can certainly be incorporated into some of the same testing frequencies, but it just needs to be identified, documented, and handled in the accordance with that. And the next element is periodic testing. This is when you have an existing building, and this is really probably one of the most controversial aspects of the creation of this. Okay, we do it once when the building is built, but when do we retest all the integrated functions Do we do that every year? Do we do that every 3 years? We do it every 5 years. And the fact of the matter is, the concept is it's going to be really, it depends. That's going to be the answer. And the code, NFPA 4, allows you to have discretion when you're creating your test plan to use good engineering judgment, use the advice of your authority having jurisdiction, your insurance companies, your ownership, as to how often that should be done. This is not intended for the Subway or the McDonald's that may technically have an integrated system to have to be retested every 5 years in the integrated fashion. Those things maybe don't have to be done for every 15 years. But when you have a high-rise hospital with lots of integrated stuff going on and the probability of making sure that stuff is at a higher risk, the recommended medium is about every 5 years the integration should be retested. It could be done at a greater frequency. It could come down to every 2 or 3 years if, once again, it's valued to be needed at a frequency. The important thing is that this stuff does get identified and does get tested from end to end. There are also some triggers identified that could trigger an integrated test. And it's pretty logical. If you have a new fire protection or life safety systems that are being installed into an existing integrated fire protection functionality system, if you're adding a whole new system in there, if you're taking what was just a fire alarm and a sprinkler system and you're adding in some complicated clean agent systems or a complicated smoke control system, then you really do need to retest all the systems from a integrated testing standpoint. If you have existing fire protections and safety systems that are modified because of different aspects, we need to take a look at that. And then you could also have, since all these systems today are software driven, if you're making significant changes to the software for an individual system that's part of the integrated system, that part should be retested. But you don't have to retest the entire building. You retest those functionalities that were touched on and were modified and changed accordingly. So you see there's some common sense that does enter into this this picture of things as we go forward into the world of NFPA 4. So, you know, that was a quick run through on 4. I hope it wasn't too fast for many of you, but you know, you'll get copies of this presentation, and I think it's a good reference. NFPA 4 today is just starting to be included in the model in the National Building and Fire Codes. What does that mean? That means that in the 2018 edition of the International Building Code, the International Fire Code, the NFPA 101 is where they'll start to see requirements for NFPA 4 execution. So it's not here at this moment today unless a specifying engineer or a local AHJ or something of that nature activates this thing as being put forward. But you as a conscientious life safety provider may want to give some thought to saying, you know what, this is probably not a bad idea in my complex life safety building to make sure that these integrated systems are working. Now you have a platform to be able to work forward on. So we're coming to our close here. And of course, to advance fire life safety, all we do is we ask you to please take a comprehensive approach for effective fire and life safety management programs as we go forward. And you'll see in the summary here, I think you'll find that these are the points that we touched on over the last 50, 55 minutes or so. And that, you know, I'm going to open it up now through Ann for any additional questions that may be percolating out there. Thank you all.
Thank you, Dan. And thanks, everyone, for your attendance thus far. We do have time for just a few questions, but before that, I'd like to go ahead and announce the winner of that $100 gift card that we had.
Is this the grand prize winner?
Yes, grand prize winner. Yes, there were a number of respondents to your survey, and the winner is Daryl Burnett of the engineering department in Intermec Incorporated. He's out of Richland, Washington. Daryl Burnett. So congratulations, Daryl, and thanks to all of you here today who responded to that survey. Okay, now we do have time for just a few questions, Dan, and we do have some good ones about NFPA. So NFPA 4, excuse me. So first off, we did have a question about the commissioning and AHJ process. So for NFPA testing, is this to include building commissioning and AHJ input simultaneously or around the same time frame, or is commissioning to precede the AHJ input?
Thank you. You know, that's an extremely good question, and I didn't touch on it, but NFPA 4 has a companion document called NFPA 3, which is also just recently created, which is this is recommended practice for the commissioning of fire protection systems. It is not a standard as of yet. It's just a recommended practice, but that is the guideline that's available to show you how one should commission an overall complex fire protection system. And yes, the AHJ is part of that team. So getting specifically back to NFPA 4, is the commissioning is being done. NFPA 4 is just a segment of that whole commissioning process. It's what gets done at the end when it says, okay, it's time to test all this stuff that we've been commissioning and verifying for. So I think the answer to that would be yes. So the AHJ certainly needs to be involved in the planning for the integrated test, and it does dovetail into the commissioning process.
Great, thank you, Dan. And I think we have time for just one more question. So again, related to NFPA 4, will major software or firmware upgrades require the integrated system test routine?
Yeah, that's another very, very good question, and I'm going to have to give my standard code development answer, and that'll be it depends. Yes, you will need to make sure you retest those areas of integration that were affected by the software or firmware upgrades. So it really needs an analysis to be made on just what extent things have been done by. And some of these, you know, it's not like you're retesting the whole building. You know, it could be just one device in a zone, one device on a floor, could be one device in a wing of a building. If all the devices in that wing or portion of the building have the same functionality through the integration process. So I don't want to make it sound like it's a scary thing, like, oh my gosh, I got to retest the whole buildings. You need to retest the integrated connection points throughout to make sure that, okay, when the detector goes off, that those elevators get recalled to the third floor, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, it's going to take some close work with your trusted service provider to make sure that those things are being understood. And we're doing a solid job of educating AHJs right now, the fire service, on what this means and how this comes together so that they'll be there to be able to help you as these things develop and move forward.
Thank you, Dan. Thanks very much. So that's looks like we're out of time, everyone. I do want to thank you again, Dan, for your presentation, and to Siemens Building Technologies for sponsoring the webinar. And of course, thank you to all the attendees for joining us today. I would like to reiterate that a recording of the webinar will be available online at facilityexecutive.com shortly, as well as on Siemens' website at siemens.com. Thanks again. Have a great day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.